Whenever you come across a turning point in Mushoku Tensei, that's when you know that something crazy is about to happen. They're these story-defining events that quite literally mark a massive change in the narrative direction. So when it comes to an episode as crucial as this, I want to make sure that you guys don't miss out on anything, especially with regards to a conflict as brief yet packed as this one, because every little detail could serve to influence an event that happens later. So let's take a look at exactly what we missed from this season's turning point. Let's get started. Episode 21, Turning Point 2, covering chapters 8 to 10 of Volume 6 of the light novel. Where we start off at the beginning of the episode is the long path between the Shirane Kingdom and the Asura Kingdom, the last stretch of mountain before Rudy could finally arrive back home. There was the occasional bandit every so often, but compared to the monsters of the Demon Continent, these bandits were a cakewalk. It was nothing more than a chore for Eris to send them packing. As for why bandits were so common here in contrast to everywhere else, well, that was mainly due to the peaceful nature of the region itself. The lack of monsters made it easy for bandits to lay ambushes pretty much anywhere. Plus, with the number of smaller countries currently fighting up north, it was likely that this was causing an increase to their number as well. Now, the exact location where we are in the anime is a continent-wide mountain range known as the Redworm Mountains, the home to the central continent's strongest monster. While one was certainly enough to be a challenge for Rudeus, what made them especially fearsome was their detection ability. No matter how small a person or creature was, if it made the mistake of trespassing into their territory, then these dragons would immediately know and swarm together to devour it. That was one of the most common facts behind them. Some other miscellaneous facts include their ranking as the strongest species of dragon, as well as their vast territory and herd mentality. That being the case, it was only natural for the Redworm Mountains to become known as this impassable mountain range, a place synonymous with death for anyone unlucky enough to traverse there. For all their power and ferocity though, the Red Worms did actually have one single weakness, and that was that their ability to fly wasn't very refined. Yes, they could maneuver themselves well enough while in the air, but it was getting into the air that was the hard part. You see, in order for a worm to be able to take flight, they would have to either jump off a cliff or run down a lengthy slope. Simply flapping their wings just wasn't enough to lift them. That's why you'd never find this species of dragon in the plains or forests. Of course, there was the occasional worm who'd fall from the skies and start wandering the plains, but that was a rare occurrence typically handled by adventurers. It was an S-rank extermination mission that required a party of at least 10. A single dragon was just that tough to handle. What made it quite the coveted quest though was the generous reward of 100 gold for completing it. That alone was enough for all 10 members to live lavishly for at least a year. So it was actually quite common for underranked adventurers to try and fail at completing it. Now, in order to traverse these mountains, there were actually two passages through which travelers could cross relatively safely. Small gorges known as the Redworm's lower jaw and upper jaw. Since the lower jaw was the path that connected the south to the west, that's the route that Rudeus was heading. It was getting there that required quite the lengthy detour though. They could just have cut straight through the mountains like how Eris wanted, but that was an endeavor that even Rudeus couldn't handle. You see, Eris had a slightly warped perception of just how strong these dragons were. Because Ghislaine had once told her of the time that she'd slain one, Eris now believed that she could too. Well, her together with Rudeus and Rudeus. What Eris was failing to consider about this story though was the fact that Ghislaine was with a party of 5, the dragon they were fighting was a grounded straggler separated from its pack, and still 2 of her members ended up dying anyway. So, if just one grounded worm was enough to take on Ghislaine and a party of advanced level swordsmen, then a whole flying swarm was definitely more than enough for their party. It was an endeavor that we now know even some of the current 7 great powers would find difficult. That's not to say that the current 7 great powers are weak, but if you go back in time to when the list had people like Laplace in it, then even the lowest rank power could pass through Redworm territory peacefully. That's just how much more powerful the 7 great powers of old were. If you're wondering just how much more powerful, well, Laplace did manage to subjugate the king of the Redworms, so you can probably imagine the level of power that would be needed to do something like that. In any case, it was as Eris and Rudeus were doing their sparring that Rudeus was contemplating the actions of the man god. After careful consideration of all his advice and the events to ensue after, Rudeus began to think that perhaps this man god was more trustworthy than he was giving him credit for. You see, the more Rudeus considered each situation, the more he started to realize that the man god's advice ensured things would turn out the same way no matter what he did. Whether it was his chance meetings with Aisha and Kashirika, getting saved by Zanoba or Ruijerd, or even just getting captured by the Doldia, all those were positive events that seemed immutable. So perhaps that meant that Rudeus could trust him after all. If that was ever going to happen though, Rudeus first wanted Hitogami to be a bit more honest with him. He didn't like how this man god's motives were always shrouded by mystery. Switching back to Eris's training now. In the year that passed since their last fight in the Demon Continent, Rudeus was no longer confident that he could beat Eris anymore. Sure, he could easily win if he used magic and had a little bit of distance to start, but if he could only use his demon eye like how it was in episode 12, then Rudeus now felt that it was impossible. Her skills in combat now surpassed anything that Rudeus's demon eye could possibly compensate for. As for the reason why Ruijerd decided to declare her a warrior, well, that was partly because of Rudeus. You see, no matter how much time had passed and how much Eris matured, Ruijerd had noticed that Rudeus would still treat her like a child. This wasn't something that Rudy saw any particular problem with, but clearly that wasn't the case for Ruijerd. So, as a means of trying to get Rudeus to understand, Ruijerd took the initial step to help him get there. It was an unusual gesture that made Rudeus feel as if this was some sort of death flag. That being the case, right before the two were about to go to sleep, Rudeus made sure to give Ruijerd a good luck charm first. A gold coin for him to keep close for the rest of their travels. Now, it was 4 months after the events in the Shirone Kingdom that Rudeus and the others would finally reach the Lower Jaw, the fateful passage in which the group would encounter their toughest obstacle yet. So, as the three of them were riding their carriage down this path, what brought them to a halt was a simple question from the man who would later introduce himself as Orsted, a strange person who both Eris and Ruijerd seemed to be utterly fearful of. While Rudeus saw him as just a person with intimidating eyes though, it was actually the young girl beside him that he was most interested by. Something about her ashen brown hair and pure white mask just made her image extremely easy to remember. Before he could inspect these two any further though, the countless splinters of Orsted's image went to make the whole thing even more strange. Then, the more questions Orsted began to ask about who they were, the more Rudeus began to get the feeling that perhaps this man was friendly. There was something about the way he talked that just made him seem satisfied, almost like he was happy to be reuniting with some old friends from the past. Of course, neither Ruijerd nor Eris knew who he was, but that didn't stop Orsted from expressing his content in seeing them alive and well. That said, because the two weren't showing any change in their hostile demeanor, Orsted simply decided to leave them be. It was as he was turning to leave, though, that Orsted would part with a couple more interesting lines. In addition to saying that he'd stay out of their way, he also went on to mention that they'd eventually come to know him. A statement spoken with such utter confidence that it was almost like it was implying that this was some sort of inevitable truth. It was for this very reason that Rudeus's intuition began to tell him that Orsted knew something that the others didn't. Something that only an existence akin to the man god would know. That was the vibe that Rudeus was currently getting from him. So, with a sudden urge to figure out what this man knew, Rudeus turned and made the biggest mistake of his life. He called out and began the conversation we see in the anime. Had Rudeus not done this, then Orsted wouldn't have contemplated why he had no memory of ever meeting him, and he also wouldn't have noticed the lack of fear from him either. Two key clues that went to indicate that perhaps this strange child could be affiliated with the man god. That being the case, the nonchalant manner that Orsted previously held with Ruijerd and Eris had now switched to a more cautious and distant one, leading Orsted to ask the final question which would seal Rudeus's fate. Now, the reason why Rudeus responded in such a prompt manner was partly because he let his guard down thinking the conversation was over, but mostly because this was the only sense that Orsted had made the entire time. You see, because the man god was something that Rudeus had never talked about, the sudden mention of his name from such a confusing character had made Rudy impulsively want to continue the conversation. He instinctively felt like this was some knowledge that they could both share together. So, out of a pure natural reaction, Rudy would speak the words that would spur Orsted into action, leading to the incredible display of combat we saw in the anime. If we start from the very beginning, the initial fight between Ruijerd and Orsted was so one-sided that the entire thing didn't even last for more than 10 seconds. It's not like Orsted was that much faster, but it was the way he moved that just made it seem that way. With every motion Ruijerd would make, Orsted would make a slightly better one to give him the advantage. It was a constant cycle in which the longer it went, the worse it would become for Ruijerd and the closer Orsted would be to completing his trap. So, as Ruijerd's balance worsened and his attacks slowed, the massive gap in experience became all the more apparent. Everything about Orsted's strategy just seemed perfect, much to the point that if there was an optimal approach to combat, then this would be a prime example of it. His movements were minimal yet effective, his positioning invited the exact attacks that he wanted, then his counters led Redworm right to the moment that he had planned for. It was a fight that was over before it had even begun. There were no options left for Redworm other than to fall for the trap that Orsted had laid for him. When Eris had charged in to fight Orsted next, what's important to note is the technique that he had used to stop her. This was the defensive water god technique called Flow, a more polished version of the one that Paul had once used on Rudeus. By gently redirecting Eris's sword with the palm of his hand, Orsted was able to send Eris flying. It was a single fluid motion that highlighted every aspect of the water god style's value. Now, when we see Rudeus pat down every part of his body next, this was actually due to the vision from his demon eye. He had just foreseen his lungs, heart, throat, and head all get crushed. A vivid scene that he could only compare to a fatality from a fighting game. So, as he checked to see if all were still there, Orsted's first attack went straight for the lungs. You see, because he knew that Rudeus was some sort of magician, Orsted had opted to eliminate any chance of retaliation by collapsing his lungs. An impact that not only fractured 6 of his ribs, but also guaranteed Rudeus's death since he couldn't cast healing magic anymore. But rather than simply lay over and die, Rudeus instead kept thinking on how to fight back. His only thought was of how if he was to die here, then Orsted would surely go back and finish off the other two. So, what we saw first was the use of the fastest stone cannon that Rudeus could conjure, followed by the most explosive fireball that he could imagine. On his initial attempt at casting it though, Orsted had used his disturb magic to interrupt it. By aiming his right hand towards the source of Rudeus's mana, he had managed to effectively seal away Rudeus's ability to gather any. Well, the ability to gather any with his right hand anyway. Since this disturb magic seemed to only work on a single target location, that meant that Rudeus could still make use of his left hand. An option that Orsted didn't even try to consider since the ability to simultaneously use multiple different schools of magic was somewhat unknown to him, especially when it came to casting them without an incantation. So, when Orsted tried to imitate it himself, although he did do it successfully on his first try, he did also mention how it was more difficult than he expected. Rudeus's unique approach to spellcasting had actually gone to impress him. Now, on the second attempt at this fireball, what Rudeus had gone to imagine was something akin to a nuke. His mind was already so far gone that he didn't even consider the possibility of Eris and Redworm getting caught up in it. All his focus was simply centered on this one final attack, an enormous ball of flame that was supposed to leave behind a mushroom cloud. What's interesting to note after though is that even after Orsted had blocked this massive attack, he was still very cautious over what Rudeus's next move could be. Just the fact that he hadn't yet healed his lungs only went to make Orsted think that perhaps Rudeus was trying to get him to lower his guard. He truly believed that there was something more to this so-called apostle. It was the instant their eyes had met though that Orsted finally understood Rudeus was only skilled at magic. Whatever more he was expecting from this disciple of Hitogami certainly wasn't going to be seen from Rudeus. He wasn't even capable of coding himself in battle aura. So, when all was said and done, Orsted was actually left feeling quite a bit disappointed. He just couldn't understand why the man god would bother with a pawn who was so apparently weak. In any case, the only other line that we missed from the rest of the encounter was a single heavy statement directed from Orsted to Eris. After seeing just how important Rudeus was to her, not only did Orsted apologize for doing what he did, but he also made sure to say that she'd understand why one day, almost as if to imply that this was a necessary and unavoidable outcome. But yeah, that was the whole conflict as it happened in the novels. When we get to the conversation with Hitogami after, there wasn't much we missed out on other than a small discussion regarding Orsted's curses. You see, Rudeus had actually begun to sympathize with him. As someone who knew what it was like to be hated by everyone around him, Rudeus understood why Orsted would become this existence that wants to destroy the world. Now, that's not to say that this is his actual motive, but Hitogami does identify this as Orsted's objective. It was something that Rudeus could personally understand since his past life had led him to that exact same way of thinking. Now, aside from that, the last thing worth mentioning is the significance of the girl with Orsted. There was something about her that Rudeus just found familiar. He wasn't sure where he'd heard her name before, but what he was sure of was the fact that he'd heard of it at least once before. Sometime in the past year, Rudeus was certain that he'd heard it mentioned. He just couldn't remember exactly where or when. But yeah, that was everything that we missed from Turning Point 2. A very eventful episode in which we can only wait to see the aftermath. Though we don't know what direction the story will go next, it probably won't be anything close to the casual adventure story that we got this season. So you can definitely expect the next 2 episodes to bring about a lot of changes. But anyway, that's pretty much everything that I got for today. If you want to know more of my personal opinion, then I think I'm going to start doing post-episode discussions on Twitch. So if you want to know what I think of the upcoming episodes, then be sure to follow on Twitch and see those potential streams on Sunday. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So, until next time, ciao!